Welcome to Kevin Deal Photography, where I take you on my journey through photography. On today's episode, I'm going to show you how to set up your R5 Mark II. I'm pleased to announce the release of my Capture One and Lightroom presets, Metamorphic Portraits, The Sound of Silver, and Rangefinder. These are all available for purchase at my website. Go to kevindealphotography.com or check out a link in the description below. And now, on to today's episode. Welcome to today's episode. If you're not familiar with Kevin Deal Photography, we do gear reviews, tips, techniques, and tutorials, and sometimes we dive into film. If any of that sounds appealing to you, click the subscribe button below. So you just got your new R5 Mark II, and maybe this is your first big boy or big girl camera, or maybe you're coming over from the original R5 and you look at the menus and you're a little intimidated about what you see, or maybe you've just never set up custom buttons and dials and you're intimidated by that. Well, today's episode, I'm going to set you up for success with your R5 Mark II, and we will dive into specific genres as well. So there will be chapters if you just want to skip ahead to your specific genre. First, I'm going to talk about my philosophy on how I think you should set up a camera for success. Then I'm going to show you how to set up the custom buttons, and then I'm going to show you how to set up the custom dials. I'm also going to show you how to save the custom modes. So let's dive into how to do that right now. For this first section, I'm going to show you how I globally set up my camera no matter what genre I shoot. One thing you hopefully already know how to do, but if you don't, we're going to go over it right now, and that is your custom shooting modes. So if you navigate to the wrench icon or the yellow menu and you go over to tab number 5, you'll see custom shooting mode. There's C1 through C3 on the R5 Mark II. When you have your camera dialed in the way you want it to, you want to register the settings to either C1, C2, or C3. For example, when I shoot environmental portraits outdoors, I have very different settings than when I shoot portraits inside the studio. So I have one assigned to custom 1, and I have the other assigned to custom 2. That way when I show up to a shoot, I just load the custom profile and I put no further thought into it, and then I can move on with my work. One final note about custom shooting modes is the auto update settings enable disable. This is important to know what it does, because if you're the type of person who wants to turn off your camera in the middle of a session and then turn it back on, and you want your settings to stay the same, you need to keep this in enable. If you disable this feature, it's going to default to whatever you save the settings as when you registered these custom shooting modes. Another area I will commonly access throughout this video is the My Menu tab or the Star menu. You can create a custom menu of commonly accessed items that aren't in multifunction or the quick menu, things like format card or exposure simulation. So I encourage you to take the time to think about how you work and what you want to commonly access and assign those to a custom menu option so you can get to these options much more quickly. Custom buttons aside, philosophically speaking, I like my camera to be laid out the same way no matter which genre I'm shooting. For today's demonstration, we will be doing this lesson in manual mode, but you can easily adapt what I'm doing here to your workflow if you prefer to use aperture, shutter, or flexible priority. So in manual mode, by default, the dial where your index finger is your shutter speed, the jog wheel on the back is your aperture, and then the dial around the mode button is how you adjust your ISO. I just leave this the same, I don't mess with it at all. But I will show you here in a minute how to reassign those dials if you choose to do so. Now on to the customization. First, press the physical menu button on your camera, then navigate over to the new lime green menus, and on the very first tab you will see Customize Buttons for Shooting. And here you will see 2 columns, one for photos and one for video. Now, if you want to customize dials, you go below that to Customize Dials Control Ring. This is the section you want to customize if, say, you're coming over from Nikon and you're used to the reverse positions of the aperture and the shutter speed dials. On Canon, it's the other way. This is where you go to change it to the Nikon way if that's what you prefer to do. So now that you know how to navigate to your custom buttons and custom dials area inside your R5 Mark II, let's apply this to specific genres of photography, and let's first start with portraiture. Like with all genres of photography, as I mentioned, my exposure triangle is the most important thing to me. I consider that area of the camera to be the primary area of the camera, but if you move your thumb over to the right, you see these two buttons right here, and I consider that to be my secondary part of the camera, along with my control ring on my lens. And I have those specific areas assigned to autofocus. So the button on the left is my toggle between one shot and servo AF. Sometimes I have subjects that are still, and sometimes I have subjects that move. I like to use this button as that toggle. The button to the right of that is my eye detection, and as I toggle this button, I can go between the left, the right, and auto. Not to be confused with eye detection, I reassign my front button to IAF. There are situations where I prefer to use IAF, but then when it gets chaotic, I find IAF to get a little confused, so I want to be able to turn it off quickly. So I assign my front button to IAF. My record button, I never shoot environmental portraits, then immediately need to move over to recording video. So I actually reassign that to my white balance, which is a much larger priority to me than switching to video, especially now that there's a toggle where I can switch seamlessly anyway. I find the multifunction button to be useful, so I leave that assigned to the default of multifunction. Another thing that's super important in portrait photography to me is where my subject is and the zone in which they reside. So after years of thought, I assign my control ring on my RF lenses to my autofocus area. This has come in handy when I need to quickly adjust the behavior of my autofocus. So you can try it out. Maybe you want to have it be your white balance or something like that, but I just prefer to have it assigned to my autofocus area. Because environmental and studio portraiture differ in settings, I have C1 or custom 1 assigned to environmental portraiture settings, and then in the My menu, I have exposure simulation turned on because my settings do absolutely affect the exposure. On C2 or custom mode 2, I have all of my studio settings assigned, and I have exposure simulation turned off because I need the screen to be as bright as possible in order for me to see what's going on while using flash. Speaking of flash, for portraiture, I also have my flash settings in my My menu so I can access them quickly. And finally, the last thing I want to talk about is I do always shoot portraits in mechanical shutter, especially when I'm not using flash, because the model is listening for an audible cue in order to change their pose. Moving on to street photography and vacation, I lump them in the same category because I actually set my camera up the same way. My exposure triangle is exactly the same. I don't reassign anything there. I shoot in manual mode. One thing I do differently over other genres is that I tend to shoot in auto ISO when I'm on vacation or when I'm shooting street, because a lot of times I need to adapt quickly to something, and it's not going to overshoot by more than a stop one way or the other. The dynamic range on my R5 Mark II is totally going to handle an over or an under exposure by a stop. That's not really that big of a deal, so I just leave it in auto ISO. But let's talk about how I set up my custom buttons and dials for vacation and street. So just like I do with portraiture, you see this box right here. I have it in one shot, but now you see how I'm changing the autofocus area. I actually assign that to my control ring because I find that when I'm shooting street photography, I often have to change my autofocus area. So on my control ring of my lenses, I program that to autofocus area. Now I find both the quick menu and the multifunction buttons to be very useful, so I do not reprogram those. I actually use those very often, so I just leave them in their default setting. Moving on to the left button, which is just to the right of back button focus, I just move my thumb over and I use this button to toggle between one shot and servo. And the reason I do that is when I'm on vacation or shooting street, there's oftentimes I'm shooting something that is stationary, so one shot is perfectly suitable for that. However, when you're in an unfamiliar place, you're in an unfamiliar situation, all of a sudden something that you want to shoot starts moving. So I press this button to toggle over to servo, and then I immediately begin tracking my subject. Moving over to the button on the right of that, another thing I encounter in both vacation and street photography is that I want to be discreet. Whether I'm in a museum and I don't want to disturb people, or I'm shooting a subject on the street and I do not want them to hear my shutter, I put the camera in silent shutter mode. So I program this button to silent shutter. Just like I do with portraiture, I am assigning this front button to IAF. I'm giving it a try. It's a new feature. Sometimes I do find it convenient to just look at something and then focus on it, but sometimes I find in complex situations it's a bit too chaotic, and so I press this button to turn it off. Also, like my portrait setup, I don't need to hit the record button and immediately go into video. There's a new seamless toggle for that, so I reassign that button to white balance because I like to adjust my white balance at the camera. So let's talk about sports and wildlife. I generally set up my camera the same way for both sports and wildlife because there's a lot of similarities. You have fast-moving subjects that are sometimes stationary, and for that reason, I tend to just leave my exposure triangle the same. I tend to slow my shutter speed down, speed it up depending on what my subject is doing because I want sharp pictures and I want clean pictures, so any opportunity to get the ISO lower is welcome. I also tend to exclusively shoot an electronic shutter with sports and wildlife because I don't want to draw attention to myself, and if I'm shooting wildlife, I don't want to startle the animal. Additionally, that stacked BSI sensor on the R5 Mark II has seemed to eliminate any sort of warping that occurs with electronic shutter, as you can see at this very high shutter speed shot of this helicopter propeller. So it can clearly handle a bird in flight or a soccer ball being kicked. Like with portraiture and street, once again, my command dial is being assigned to my autofocus area because when you're shooting either wildlife or sports, it is sometimes hard to predict where your subject is going to go. So any sort of advantage you can give yourself with autofocus predictability is appreciated. And once again, the recurring theme is that this button you see right here is my toggle between one shot and servo, whether it is a bird sitting on a log or an athlete at rest, and then they transition to flight or the athlete starts playing their particular sport. I want to be able to toggle very quickly from one shot to servo so I can start tracking my subject while they move. Moving on to the button to the right of that, when I shoot sports, I have that assigned to action priority on and off toggle. So far, I find action priority to be a great assistance. However, it's only limited to 3 sports at this time. So if I'm shooting something like skateboarding or I'm shooting something like baseball, I have to turn it off. For wildlife, I found the button to the right of that I've been assigning to AE lock because sometimes it'll get confused if there's brush behind a bird. So if I like the way things are and I just want to lock in my focus, I'll hit that button. And I found that I've liked that for AE lock. The front button, once again, I'm using for IAF. I'm not really sure if I like it for wildlife or sports at this point, but I have it there. And like with the previously mentioned genres, both the quick menu and the multifunction buttons I leave in their default settings. But this time my record button for both sports and wildlife, I don't have assigned to white balance. Instead, I have it assigned to drive mode because sometimes I don't want to burst a bunch of shots, especially if a bird is sitting or an athlete is at rest. And one final thing I want to talk about is in my Mind menu, I do program pre-shoot continuous because I find that to be useful for both sports and wildlife. Now let's wrap up my final thoughts on how to program the R5 Mark II. So that's really it. Now, these are not like set in stone. These are not my way of saying you have to do it this way. The point of this video was not for me to tell you how to program your camera. The point of this video was to show you how I program my camera. Then you kind of have to evaluate what's important to you, where you like things to be laid out, and then from there, you can program them to whatever you want. I do feel like I owe a little bit of an apology to both landscape and astrophotographers because I don't really shoot either genre. So I don't really feel like I'm an authority on either of those genres. So I would feel out of place telling you how to program your camera, but hopefully looking at how I program and set up my camera for other genres, it may give you some really good ideas about how you should set up your camera for both landscapes and astrophotography. And of course, you macro photographers out there, I don't really shoot macro either. So my most sincere apologies, but I think that if you are a seasoned photographer, you can take a look at how I'm doing things, evaluate your situation, and apply them to how you do things. One final tip I want to give you when I'm using autofocus as just a master override is I do use touch and drag. So sometimes when I have the camera up to my eye like this, if I don't feel like the autofocus is locking into whatever it is that I'm trying to lock in on, whether I'm using IAF or I'm using a subject to text tracking or I'm using one of the boxes inside my autofocus area, sometimes it's easy to just take your thumb, drag that point to wherever it needs to go. It's just kind of a last resort. I will say though that on the newer cameras like the R5 Mark II, I am using this feature less and less. It was definitely a much more critical feature to use on the original EOS R, which didn't have as sophisticated autofocus as this new R5 Mark II. But I did want to tell you about it just in case you needed some sort of a final layer of a master override for your autofocus where you wanted it to lock onto. you can always program, and I use just the lower right quadrant to program my my focus point with my thumb. So hopefully these tips that I gave you today will help you get up and running with your R5 Mark II. Once again, these are not set in stone. You don't have to do them the way I do them. As a matter of fact, I want you to tell me in the comments below how you program your R5 Mark II and what works for you. That does it for today's episode. I want to thank each and every one of you for watching today. How do you program your R5 Mark II? Do you agree with the way that I have my layouts? If not, tell me how you do your layouts. And if you like this channel, I humbly ask you to click the subscribe button below. And if you like some of the presets I used throughout this episode, I do have them for sale for both Capture One and Lightroom on my website. I'll leave a link in the description below. And until next time, I'll talk to you soon. Bye.